So our first speaker today is Mike Billman. Mike Billman joined dTerra Solutions in 2014 when MPI was acquired by dTerra. Mike leads dTerra's sales, product, commercialization, and marketing efforts. Mike assists clients in identifying needs and implementing strategies from product design through delivery. Prior to dTerra, Mike was VP of Sales and Marketing for New Product Innovations, MPI, a leading product development and manufacturing firm born out of GE, where he led business development, sales, and marketing efforts. He was also instrumental in establishing a new biomedical division to help U.S. companies sell and distribute medical devices in China. Mike currently serves on the board of the Greater Columbus Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and he earned his bachelor's degree from Miami University of Ohio in media management. Thank you very much, Mike.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Pat, and thanks for hosting this event. And I guess with that, I should share my screen. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, we'll do that. Is that up now?
Not quite.
Okay, let's make sure.
There we go.
Good?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks again. Mike Billman with dTerra Solutions, as Pat mentioned. My challenge today, quite frankly, in 10 or 12 minutes or so is to share really my perspective in terms of, working in and around China, in that time period. So again, you're going to get some, snapshots of our experience and kind of a lens on what we see. And, with that being said, I'd probably better dig into some more background. So my firm essentially is a product development, manufacturing, and global supply chain company based here in Columbus, Ohio. We have offices in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong as well. We've been helping clients in the consumer automotive markets for really over 30 years. With either low-cost manufacturing solutions or even opening up the China market for them. We work with early-stage companies to Fortune 50 organizations. Today, I think you'll get a little bit of a 360-degree perspective on China, just based on that experience in working China, quite frankly, in both directions. As a manufacturing factory of the world, as it has been known for many years, to a market opportunity for many clients. And I think you'll hear as I go through, my portion here, that we truly, or I look at it that, we're agnostic when it comes to designing solutions that may work for various clients, because there are so many different products, so many different product applications. Our playbooks have to adjust depending on the objectives that an individual client might have, either with producing products in a market like China, or as I said, selling into a market. We work with some pretty smart, savvy supply chain folks, management teams, and even if you're on the board of directors of a private company or some of the publicly held companies, we understand the complexities and the risk that can be associated with products that are being manufactured, certainly offshore. Our perspective is we view that there are still risks in manufacturing, even in your own domestic market. But our job is really to have discovery sessions, to listen, to learn, and then put in solutions that provide value for our clients. And as long as we can do that, and as long as China is a part of that equation and math from a total cost perspective, we think China is right for many firms and many of our clients. We also have the view that in many applications, China might not be the market of choice, okay? There are a lot of great companies out there that have their own domestic manufacturing capabilities. China may be considered the last frontier and a slippery slope. We've got trade, discussions, headwinds, with tariffs and other noise, coming out of, both sides of the market, US and China. So we think it's appropriate that companies and individuals are taking the time to kind of figure out what makes best sense for their specific, applications. And so, as I said, we're really in a position because of our experience that, you know, we are there to provide value if it makes sense for our clients. If it doesn't, then we're okay with it. We're not the right solution for every organization. And as far as China as a market, we absolutely view that as a tremendous opportunity for many. And many of our clients are doubling down on China as we speak today. With 1.4 billion people and disposable income rising, it's a right market for many. And I would just say that, you know, when we look at solutions, we're looking at solutions, you know, around the world. So in terms of contingency plans, you know, we're operating in China. It's not to say that we aren't looking at other regions, Vietnam, India, other markets. And if those solutions end up providing better total cost, or there's incentives to do that, then absolutely we'll look at, you know, migrating to those regions where it does make sense. And I'll talk a little bit about global supply chains, and I think global is really the key word there. There's a lot of complexity built in supply chains today. And when you look at it, yeah, the reshoring discussions are loud, and there's a lot of pride there around made in the USA. We get it, you know, we understand it. And quite frankly, we think it's appropriate for many companies in certain spaces. We've gone through a pandemic here. You look at PPE and shortages, absolutely, it makes perfect sense for some companies to have products, you know, obviously produced here domestically. You look at pharma, for instance, absolutely, whether it's the United States or North America and Canada, no question about it. You look at defense and national security, absolutely, there's applications that would make appropriate sense. So we'll see if there's a phased approach to bringing product in those categories back. But we sense that if there's a total discussion about decoupling, we don't know what that looks like, quite frankly. And when you look at it from a macro, you know, larger kind of view, holistically, companies like Walmart, absolutely more domestic content here in the United States in produce, but on any given day, they could have 250 containers coming in from China. You look at Amazon, you've got 250,000 providers in China selling on their platform. What do the input costs look? What do the purchase price to the U.S. consumer look like if, you know, those supply chains are totally disrupted? You know, in other cases, you know, Apple, a very sophisticated, complex supply chain. They're pretty quiet about their content in any one country, but is China a huge market for them as a company selling? Absolutely. They're making there, selling there, and obviously as a manufacturing base. Have they migrated to Vietnam? Absolutely, in some cases and categories. Japan sourcing, absolutely. They're pulling product out of Europe and certainly here in the United States. You look at a company like Medtronic in ventilators, okay? Very complex machine with 1,600 components from over 14 countries. Okay, if you're assembling and located in the UK right now and feeding the European market, for instance, with ventilators, and then all of a sudden you're forced to have everything flow through the United States with final, you know, assembly and delivery, you know, how does that look for a company like a Medtronic? They're very complex decisions and discussions, and the economics around moving supply chain is not easy. It can be very expensive. Can it be done? Will it be done? In many cases, yes. In other cases, we just really don't see the light unless there are just some significant changes that occur not only here in the United States, but on a global basis to make it easier to look at moving tooling and other aspects of your supply chain. So I don't know, Pat, that was maybe 10, 12 minutes of commentary. And with that being said, I'll probably turn it over to you and Dan to take forward from here.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Yep.
All right, next up we have Dan Harris. And again, as you have questions, send them to me via chat. So we got a lot of great information from Mike just now. So as you're mulling over what Mike said, send your questions to me via chat. Up next, we have Dan Harris. Dan Harris is a founding member of Harris Bricken, an international law firm with lawyers in California, Washington, Oregon, Spain, and China. Dan mostly represents companies doing business in emerging market countries. Most of his time is spent helping American and European countries navigate Asia in setting up companies overseas, drafting international contracts, protecting IP, and overseeing M&A transactions. Of course, both Dan and Mike have longer introductions, and if you would like to read the full introductions, they're all over the internet. So, Dan, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Hello, everyone. Glad to be back in the Midwest, if only virtually. I'm actually from Michigan, graduated from college in Iowa, graduated from law school in Indiana, and my wife is from Illinois. And most importantly, for everyone there in Columbus, my father got his PhD long ago from the Ohio State University. So I feel a bit like I'm home. Let me turn on my slideshow here. The big question today is obviously, should I stay or should I go? And I'm going to give you the conclusion right away and let you know that it's the typical lawyer's answer, and that is, it depends. And what does it depend on? Many things, of course, but one is, are you already there? Two, are you going in? What are we talking about? Are we talking about contract manufacturing where you're paying a company in China to make your widgets? That's one thing. Are we talking about greenfield manufacturing where you're building your own facility in China? That's another thing. And then there's a third thing, which is, are you going into China to sell your product or service? And I will very briefly talk about all three of those things at the end. Before the end, I'm going to talk about some of the factors that are going to influence these decisions. And they're mostly big picture factors because the big picture has become so important with China these days. As a very quick bit of background, I and my firm, probably about 15 of us, have been dealing intensively with China for 15 to 20 years. Before that, believe it or not, our big country that we most often dealt with was Russia. Seattle had gotten very close to Russia, so close, in fact, that there were flights. Alaska Airlines had direct flights from Seattle to the Russian Far East. Russia fell off a cliff, as everyone or most of you probably know. And so I am always very concerned that US-China relations are going to fall off a cliff as well. And Mike said that he doesn't know what decoupling would look like. And I don't know what decoupling would look like either, but I can say that decoupling has already begun to the extent that both China and the United States just about every day are doing something to the other to indicate that relations are deteriorating. And relations are deteriorating and trade is deteriorating. And I long ago became of the view that both countries want a decoupling. Now, how far they want to go is not clear. What it's going to look like when this stops is not clear. But I believe that both Xi and Trump, who I think are very similar in a lot of ways, want a slow decoupling. They actually want a fast decoupling, but they realize that a fast decoupling would destroy both, would be terrible for both economies. So what they seem to both be doing is encouraging companies to sort of stop doing business with the other country in limited respects. the Trump tariffs are a great example of that. Okay, so a little bit of history here. This is a blog post we wrote way back in 2018, back when just about everybody thought that the trade war would be solved by China buying more soybeans. Nobody agreed with us back then when we said it's more than a trade war. The trade war is just a symptom. It's not the disease. And the US is doing what it can to isolate China and remove it from the world of international trade. I think all those things are pretty apparent now. August 2nd, 2019, we dubbed the relationship the new normal. And we said, this war will not end because it is much more than a trade war. It is political, economic, and low-level military war. People were furious with us for saying that. Our response was, we're not writing the way we want things to be. We're writing about the way we see things. Then we said the better question is not when it will end, it's how it is going to spread, and spread it has. We said economics is not the central issue for China, and we said the same holds true for the United States. Then on August 12th, 2019, we listed out 14 wild cards and future risks. Most of them at the time were theoretical. I've gone back and looked at those. Many of those have now become reality, and what was reality then is a lot worse now. Some of the things we talked about Hong Kong. Hong Kong has gotten worse. Its special status is hanging by a thread right now. We talked about the South China Sea and Taiwan. That's gotten worse. We talked about the FBI investigating about 1,000 IP trade secret theft cases against China. That has now tripled. And we view that as very political. I mean, that's the US saying, we're coming after you. That's the US saying, we don't want you. Then we talked about Huawei going on the entity list and restrictions against Chinese tech companies. That has happened, that keeps happening. We talked about how there might be a tipping point when consumers in the US and the EU and elsewhere become so troubled with how China treats its Uyghur and Tibetan populations and how it acts against Hong Kong and Taiwan, that it will lead people to stop wanting to buy Chinese products. Right now, when we wrote that, China was actually viewed favorably by the majority of Americans. Today, it's viewed favorably by only 1/4 of Americans. Today, the EU is making very clear its dissatisfaction with China. Things are changing. China has barred shipments from Australia. China is fighting with Canada. China is fighting with the EU. Look at what's been going on in the United States with George Floyd. People are saying, we're not going to deal with this company. People are going to start saying that about American companies dealing with China. I get emails from people saying, why shouldn't we boycott American companies that get their products from China? My answer is because a lot of them don't have any choice yet. Okay, on the manufacturing side, the risks are higher than I have ever seen them. China's manufacturing industry is hurting. They've gone through their own COVID. They've gone through a decrease in demand worldwide due to COVID. Chinese factories are going bankrupt. This is relevant for those of you who are doing contract manufacturing in China. We are getting more calls than we've ever gotten, including during the 2008 recession, from companies that sent money to their longtime Chinese supplier, and that the money's gone, as is their China supplier. The risks are high right now. We wrote about this. Whenever there's a big decline in demand for Chinese products, your risk of getting nothing or getting junk instead of what you ordered goes way up. That is happening. it's happening a lot with PPE. That's just an indicator. So, but what are we talking about in terms of leaving? Who should leave? Where do they go? So if you're having your widgets manufactured in China and you can have them manufactured somewhere other than China without paying much more, then you should. I always say that all our clients who do contract manufacturing in China want to get out. All of them. Everyone that I ask them, they'll say, sure, I'd love to leave. Problem is, most of them can't. Some have left. A lot of them want to leave. Some are going to try to leave within a year, some within 3 years. Many of them are never going to be able to leave. China is, let's face it, amazing at producing all sorts of different products. So that's really a question of whether you can leave or not. Greenfield manufacturing, should you go build a facility there? That depends. If you're building the facility there to sell to China, that's a different issue than if you're building a facility there to sell to the United States. There are big risks there. The companies that do that sort of thing tend to know how to analyze those risks. What about selling your products and services into China? The answer to that, I think, is easy. If you're still making money, or if you think you can make money, then do it, especially if it will be easy for you to leave. Mike talked about how he's got clients who are doubling down with this. We have clients who are doubling down with this. That makes sense. There are ways to sell into China without having to send 300 people there that are safer, but it really, again, it depends. What about the companies that are leaving China with their manufacturing? Where are they going? So a lot of them are nearshoring. That's the popular thing. They're going to Mexico for the United States. They're going to Poland for Europe. They're reshoring. Not many. We have one client who's going to be building a very high-tech factory in Tennessee. They're going everywhere else. Where are people having their widgets made, if not China? Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Mexico, Poland, Portugal, etc. It all depends on your product. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So go ahead and send your questions in to me via the text function. And while you're messaging your questions into me, we'll get started off with this question. And Mike, go ahead and let's see, I can unmute you, I think, Mike, unless you beat me to it.
I can do that. There we go.
Yeah, great, thanks. There have obviously been tensions between China and the US since there's been a China and the US. What is qualitatively different about the current relationship between the US and China that affects people's decision-making versus, related to where they should be doing business compared to, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago? Where there have been a lot of hiccups in US-China relations. How is this different?
Yeah, I think it's about the speed in which some of the dialogue and communications flow today, and it's very difficult to understand, what's chatter and what's real. You just face it. I mean, we can go, one day where Navarro says, phase one is done and we're decoupling, to a few minutes later the administration saying, no, that's not correct. So I think for anybody that's running a company now, it's better to have some degree of certainty. Okay, it's better, we believe, to have a long-term plan, a strategic plan. It's better, as we view it, to have deep, meaningful dialogue and to build trust, not only between governments, but then within, various businesses. And we view that takes time, and it has. There's been a lot of work done for many, many years in developing relationships and trust, and to see the rhetoric and how things are flowing. It's so fluid right now that it's so challenging to make good, smart, intelligent decisions in the short term, as I said, to fundamentally like pick up and move a supply chain based on either a tweet or a comment from the administration, it could be really risky. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. And as I mentioned, I think to some that, when we look at the history of the United States at under 250 years and China at 4,000, we got completely different cultures, and there should be respect between the two. And it just, in my view, it takes a long time to make sure that, that trust is coming through on both sides. Will we get to more balanced trade? I'm very hopeful. Will we get to calmer minds in this? That's the only way I see us getting to yes. But this discord that goes on a daily basis makes it really challenging. And I'm all for, and I know we got some really smart people behind the scenes. It's just the daily stuff that we see, which is really, really challenging for anyone that's trying to work the market. Might have lost you.
Patrick, you're on mute.
There we go. Dan, your perspective?
Okay. This is the way I see things, and this is why I see things as so different right now. I'm going to try and hold this up. It's a graph I just drew of the way I see things in China up to 2013. Things were constantly getting better. Then they flatlined. And then in 2018, they started getting worse. And I'll talk very briefly about the things that I saw getting better and then getting worse. And for me, it's been qualitatively different because up until 2018, I was always defending China. And if you go look at our China Law blog, where I showed all these things saying things are getting worse, I would always tell people, be patient. It's ridiculous to expect China, for instance, to have an IP protection system as strong as the United States. It hasn't been in the world community long enough. I kept calling for people to give China time on various different things. And I would do that for the same, because China was slowly but surely getting better on everything. It was getting better on IP. It was getting better with its treatment of foreign companies. It was getting better with its treatment of foreigners. It was getting better in terms of its limits and restrictions it would put on foreigners. It was getting better on human rights. It was getting better on censorship. But all of those things, if you look at all of those, it has gotten worse. And arguably, the United States has, in a way, also. I'm embarrassed and furious with the anti-foreign sentiment in the United States that's been directed at Asians here in the United States. No matter what your view is on China's fault or lack of fault for the coronavirus, it's horrible to blame anyone individually who is in the United States based on their ethnicity or skin color. So when I talk about things getting worse on these things, yes, I am mostly talking about China, but look at something like tariffs and other restrictions. That a lot of that's been coming from the US as well. So things are qualitatively different. The two countries are arguing, well, not just the two countries, because what people seem to forget is that China and the EU are really at loggerheads right now also. But talking about the US and China, they're fighting very, very publicly. And you can't go back from that. I can remember writing many times on our blog that the effective way to get China to change is through back channels. No country likes to be told what to do, big or small. And if you tell a country what to do and then they go do it, it makes their leaders look weak. So when a country is publicly telling another country what to do, a lot of times they're not really telling them that to get change. They're telling them that for their own domestic audience. And that's what we've been seeing for the last 2 years. Now, I've been to a lot of events where people have talked about this. I went to a huge event at Berkeley in 2018. There were 100 people there. There were about 30 academics, 30 lawyers, 30 business people. And I mean, it was at Berkeley. I mean, Berkeley, it wasn't in Tupelo, Mississippi, let's say. And I expected everyone to be against where Trump was going. And shockingly enough, just about everyone was of the view, we don't know if this is the right thing to do, but we do know that what the US has been doing quietly over the last 5 years has not worked. And there were a lot of ex-government officials there who had been very actively involved in trade negotiations with China. So things have changed.
Thanks, Dan. Next question is for Mike. What products, or primarily products, do you see as being still appropriate to have manufactured in China and sell to US buyers and or Chinese buyers, but primarily the US buyers, traditional model?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we see products that have some degree of complexity, some sophistication to them are still really good fits for China. China's up their game in terms of capability, technology, or what have you. So when you have some pretty sophisticated delivery systems, electrical, mechanical type devices, we still see China as playing in that game. And we've talked about, Vietnam and furniture, and if you're making shoes and apparel items, absolutely maybe a better fit from a lower cost perspective. But China has their 2025 plan, and they've got a made in China perspective, and they've got a whole view of competing, at higher levels in terms of degrees of complexity with regards to their manufacturing capabilities, AI, robotics, and what they're doing. So we're finding that they can be very when we go up the value chain in terms of more complexity with some of our products and the tight tolerancing that are required there. So, we've got labor inputs that are, obviously much lower than here in the US. We've got really strong infrastructure in China. As I said, we've got some headwinds with certainly the tariff situation, but the reality is when you stack up the tariffs on top of the X-Works numbers, we're still well below, in most cases, where that product can be made in the United States of America. And until that changes, I don't see a mass migration, from China to the United States or to other economies. The math has to make sense, and that's where we're still seeing value. People say, how does that work, with tariffs and all of that? And the reality is that's what we do for a living. We lay out total cost of ownership for US companies, no matter where they want to make the widget in the world. And as I said, as long as that equation spells opportunity in China, then we'll continue to see that. But we're seeing it more in the value add items and not commodities per se, to answer your question.
Got it. Thanks, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is for Dan. And this kind of ties into what you were saying before, but for businesses that go to China, so why did US businesses go to China in the beginning, i.e. the late 70s, early 80s? And what is different about China now versus then to change the calculus?
Okay, I love that question. So in the 80s, people would call us up and they would say, I want to have my widgets made in China. And even though we were lawyers and not their consultants, we would say, why? And they would say, because it's going to save me 10%. And we would explain why that was not enough, because they were not allowing for the fact that 1 out of 5 shipments they would get would be worthless. They were not allowing for the extra costs that would be necessary by paying the inflated fees of international lawyers as opposed to the somewhat less inflated fees of domestic lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was a point where we completely stopped asking that question, because China had gotten so good, meaning that it wasn't 1 in 5 shipments anymore. It was, 5% of each shipment, not that different from anywhere else. And so we just stopped questioning people about that. And the cost savings were there. And there were clients who literally could not get the product made anywhere else. So they had no choice. So that's that. Then we had clients who were essentially forced to go to China, because let's say we had a couple suppliers to the auto industry or to Caterpillar or to Apple or whatever, and they were basically told, you need to go to China. And I remember one client of ours said, we told them we don't want to go to China. We don't care if you buy your China and Asia products from someone else. And the giant company said, no, you don't understand. If you don't go to China, we're not only going to stop buying your product for our Asia equipment, we're going to stop buying it for the entire world. And so that was happening. Also, China was booming. China's economy was growing at, even if you don't believe the numbers, which I don't, they were still growing at probably 8% a year. And there are 1.4 billion people, and everything was looking up. So there were a lot of good reasons for going to China. What has changed? Mike touched on it. Uncertainty. If you're going to save 5% by going to China, and is it worth it? Now, we have we've done a lot of talking with our clients. We have one client, I said, why are you still making this in China? It seems like you could make it somewhere else. And the client said, I sell this product for $8. It costs me 10 cents to make. I don't care about the tariff. There are companies like that. But then what's interesting, and what I find a little frustrating, is that, and Mike touched on this, there are certain products, like high-end complicated products, which if you're not going to manufacture it yourself, you pretty much need China. Taiwan competes a bit. It's more expensive. Korea, Japan, et cetera, they're more expensive. But there are certain products where we have clients who are moving out of China now, and I'm tempted to say to them, yeah, why didn't you move out years ago? So, and Mike touched on those products, clothing, furniture. A lot of those should have been made elsewhere years ago, and now they are. And what I always like to point out is jeans, which is a kind of, it's not a very complicated product. It's a popular product. I think as recently as a year ago, China was the #1 exporter of jeans to the United States. Now it's Mexico. Bangladesh is #2. And probably by right now, Vietnam is #3. That's how quickly China's fallen. So on some products, it really makes sense. The world has changed. On others, it really hasn't.
All right. We have a lot of questions, so we'll get through as many as we can. So it's great that you guys are stirring up the juices here. And nobody will ever accuse us of having a webinar with only one point of view represented. All right. This question is for Mike. From a supply chain standpoint, what does a 5 and 10 years point of view outlook look like for Sino-American relations? Knowing, for example, that raw materials such as iron, which China supplies nearly 50% of raw iron and U.S. consumes up to 41 million metric tons of iron each year. So supply chain standpoint, 5 years out, 10 years out, how do you think U.S.-China relations go? Time to shake that magic 8-ball.
Yeah, that's another good one, and a little tricky when you're talking specifically about, you know, that type of raw material or iron. There's been a lot of protectionist around that, you know, in terms of steel making here in the United States, and you know, significant you know, tariffs and or duties on or anti-dumping, you know, for various steel products coming, you know, out of China. And so I actually see that one to be a little more defensive on both sides, you know, with the U.S. protecting as much as they can our industry that certainly feeds into national security. And I see China probably doubling down as they look at their 2025 initiative with regards to, you know, made in China. As that infrastructure continues to grow in China, you know, Chinese factories will be, you know, continued to be turned on to feed that economy. So I think when you're talking specifically around iron or steel, you know, those are very heavy commodities inputs on both fronts. So when you're in country and supplying to the domestic economy, that makes perfect sense. But from an import-export perspective, I still see some significant challenges there on both fronts in terms of opening up the waters, let's call it, and supporting each other's economies from a raw steel perspective, put it that way.
Got it. Thanks, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is for Dan. What is your advice for a U.S.-based food service company looking to enter China, i.e. pizza, hamburger, similar fast or fast casual category? I'm hearing the economics might be right in China right now, as there's been some fallout in this segment. There's more real estate available, lease rates have dropped, labor, there's a lot of labor available, and much of this is coming because of COVID-19. How do you see this? How do you see the outlook for a food service company going into China right now?
I think it's actually quite good. I agree. We've done a lot of work with fast casual restaurants in China, and I'm not sure if that's what we're talking about here, but I'll talk about that, and also just selling food into China. We've done a lot of work with fast casual restaurants, and there definitely was a period where the rents were so high that they were having trouble opening up new restaurants. And the way China's corporate system was set up for foreign companies, it could be expensive because a lot of cities would require you to set up a new company in their city if you were going to have restaurants in their cities. So some of our clients, we represent a big fast casual restaurant. They had like 11 or 12 companies in China, and that adds to the expense. But China has made that easier. China is, believe it or not, fairly welcoming of these sorts of businesses today. So I think it is a good time. In terms of selling food into China, our clients that do that have always done well. China likes foreign foods, just like Americans like foreign food. And most of our clients that have done that have not gone in with 200. And the other good thing about something like that is you don't go in with 200 people and set up your own distribution network. You work with a high level, of which there are many, food distribution company in China that will get your product into the stores. So you can do that sort of thing in a fairly low risk way. And doing distribution deals in China are not that complicated. They're basically the same as doing them anywhere else, including in the United States.
Thank you very much. Next question is for both of you. The current pandemic has become a politically charged topic in U.S.-China relations. Do you see this as an intentional step towards decoupling, just saber rattling, or trying to deflect blame? Do you think that this relationship can be repaired? So, Mike, why don't you lead off, since Dan will take turns here. Mike, you lead off and we'll hear from you.
I'm an optimist by nature. That's just who I am. So I'm very hopeful that calmer heads can come together, and you look at the totality of discussions that are going on with regards to trade and COVID and whether or not, China, weaponized the virus. I mean, it really, hits home and hits some nerves, depending on who you're talking to, whether it's an individual from China or from the United States from that perspective. And I would like to tend to stay out of the political, aspect and realms, because I know there's just so much going on behind the scenes that we all don't see on a daily basis. And all I can say and hope and pray that there are going to be some really meaningful discussions around, getting to yes on multiple fronts. But as long as we are pointing the finger at the source or what happened or vice versa, it's really, I think, challenging, to get to yes on multiple fronts. So that's just my opinion. I don't have all the answers on what's going on, because I just truly don't know everything that's involved administratively. Fair
enough. Dan?
And I am also an optimist by nature, believe it or not. I think that both sides are using COVID for political reasons. And I think if it weren't COVID, it would be something else. I don't see COVID as, I mean, definitely there's been anger created by COVID. But I just view that as one of many things that are causing problems. And I'm hoping, for the sake of the world, that this is a short-term problem and it disappears. And if COVID does disappear in, let's say, 5 months, I suspect that the anger from it will start dissipating. But there'll be other things.
Yeah, exactly. Quite something. This question is for Dan, but I think, Mike, you may have some experience in this, anecdotes to share in this area too, so feel free to jump in. Many Chinese companies are also leaving the mainland and moving manufacturing to Southeast Asia to avoid some of the issues in U.S.-China relations, and, as an aside, labor costs. Do you see some of the same stories about intellectual property infringements in those countries where they've moved to, not holding up contracts with these companies now that they're in new countries?
Okay. So I mentioned that we have an American company that's building a facility in Tennessee. What I didn't mention is that they are doing it in tandem with they have something like 9 Chinese suppliers, and they're building this US facility in tandem with their best Chinese supplier. So yeah, a lot of Chinese companies are looking to leave also. IP and holding up contracts. China, it has been and is way better at both those things than the world gives them credit. I call it the 90% rule, which is that for 90% of companies, China is surprisingly pretty good at IP and quite good at enforcing contracts. And it may even be 95%. If you have a high-level semiconductor factory, or if you're making high-level semiconductors that the Chinese government wants a piece of, then you're at huge risk. But if you enter into a contract with your manufacturer in China to make rubber duckies, and that contract says that your manufacturer cannot sell your rubber duckies to anyone else, and they do it, and you sue that company in China, you will win. So it's not that bad. So let's talk about other countries. Other countries, Mexico, Vietnam, they're not that bad either, meaning that foreign companies that go in, or American companies that go into emerging market countries and do it the right way, I'm not going to say they never have problems, because obviously they do. But I really think that a lot of the problems that companies have surrounding IP or contracts in emerging market countries are the fault of the developed country company, because they go into China or Vietnam or Mexico or Thailand as if they're doing a deal with somebody in Cincinnati, Ohio, and that is not going to work. You've got to do more due diligence on the company, et cetera. But, you know, look at the problems. Look at the big companies, Apple, GE, Procter & Gamble. They've been international for a long time and they're doing fine. And the other thing that you also have to realize is that take a company like Procter & Gamble. Have they had IP problems in China? I'm going to assume they have. Have they had contract problems in China? I'm going to assume they have. But I'm also going to assume that those problems have had very, very little impact on Procter & Gamble's profits. And so one of the things we always tell our clients is keep your eye on the prize. If you go into China and somebody rips off your t-shirt design and you're making $100 million from being in China, who cares? They could also rip off your t-shirt design without you going into China. So you really have to look in depth at what you're doing. So, you know, it really, again, lawyer answer, it depends on what you're doing, where you're going, and your product. But there's no country out there that I'm aware of. Now there might be, but none of our clients have ever gone in, where it's hopeless.
Right, yeah. I think the larger organizations have the chest to defend themselves in a market like China, you know, for instance, you know, no question about it. If you're knocked off with your stores or branding or anything else, it's the smaller companies that might have a little more challenge there in terms of getting whole in bad contracts, for instance. I mean, we work really hard on our contracts. You know, with our manufacturing partners, we're doing all the negotiations, you know, in native tongue. But beyond the contracts, it's always been for us about relationships and being in those facilities on a weekly basis, knowing who is making our products. And we know that, you know, even when you talk about product moving from China, and some has moved certainly to Vietnam, you look at some of the financing there, the ownership structures, those are Chinese individuals or entities in many cases that control the Vietnamese, you know, manufacturing. So as Dan kind of talked to, you know, when you look at due diligence assessments, when we go in and do a top-down, you know, from structural management, FCPA, you know, compliance, all the way down to the product level and engineering and all that in terms of capability. But you better know who you're dealing with. And what we found is it's just best to be there. We would not be doing what we do without having our own team of, you know, individuals on the ground in China that know that market inside and out in terms of, you know, the relationship side of it. I can just tell you that.
Well, one thing, and we're running out of time. We have time for, I'll squeeze in one more question, but I'd like to hear that from both of you. You really have to make a business decision, right? So instead of relying on emotion or the tide of U.S.-China relations, ultimately it comes down to what's your particular business case and what are the numbers, right? So let's give another 1 minute to the last question. It's not the last question that was asked, but it was the last time we had time for. I apologize to those whose questions were not, we didn't have time to cover. But How do you see the Chinese market developing for smaller foreign consulting firms, specifically organizational consulting? Would it make sense for a smaller Western organizational consulting firm to enter the Chinese market? And either of you can take a crack at it.
I would just say perhaps, and like Dan said throughout the session, it depends. Consulting for who, consulting what? I mean, at the end of the day, what value are you bringing to your customer? And if you've got a business model, strategy where you are bringing value, then absolutely it can make perfect sense. But without knowing all the details, I can't sit here and answer and say, yeah, that's a great idea, you know, to do that. We do a lot of consulting, a lot of shepherding, I would call it, with folks that are trying to enter the China market. And you know, it's a phased approach, and it allows, you know, individuals or companies to not go all in and take all that risk in one bite, you know, so you can learn and digest, you know, does anybody care about my product or technology there? You know, what's the channel look like? Pricing elasticity, you know, key opinion leaders, the channel, all of those kind of pieces you have to lay out. So again, without knowing specifically, you know, the consulting arena that you're talking about, I can't say one way or another whether I would view it as the right decision at this point. I'd love to have more conversation with you outside of this session. Feel free to email me or call me, and I'm sure we can talk further.
Great, thanks, Mike.
I would agree with everything Mike says. The only thing I would add is that what we have seen from our consulting clients is that those who go into China and provide services to foreign companies there tend to do very well. Those who go into China expecting Chinese companies to pay them their normal rates for consulting tend to do very badly.
Yep. Well said. Thank you very much. So this will conclude the formal portion of our event, but we're not quite done because for those of you who can stick around for a little bit more, we have virtual networking where we'll break into small group, virtual rooms of 4 to 5 people each, and you can continue your conversations in those rooms. But again, I want to say thank you to Mike and Dan for joining us today. Between the two of you, there are decades and decades of expertise in U.S.-China business, and I encourage everybody who's on the call today and folks who will end up watching the recording of this online later because they could not join us, to go ahead and reach out to Mike and Dan for additional support. Thank you very much to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you all.